So a little while back, I did a short on my video on the Galli, where I talked about Rome's complicated relationship with eunuchs, and one particularly morbidly curious viewer asked the following question. But what was the process? I mean, I understand the result, but presumably there was more to it than just lobbing off the slave's junk. After I read this question, I realized I didn't actually know what the answer was. So my original plan was to do a little bit of research and then respond with a short. But if you're looking at the status bar below, you can see that this is not going to be a short video. On one hand, I'm clearly incapable of brevity, but on the other, there's actually a lot to say on the topic, which is kind of interesting. So I got sucked down a research rabbit hole, and here we are. Alan Plum, you have no idea the events you have set forth this day. Turns out there's a lot to eunuchs in the Roman world. There are the Christian ones we talked about, that was interesting. There were the Galli, that was really interesting, but there's more to it than that, and it's interesting to explore that as well. But before we start, as is typical, I would love it if you could toss me some algorithm bloops. Just head on below, like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. All the cool kids are doing it. It makes a big difference in pushing back against that terrible, terrible narrative that's out there, that trans people are this new thing that's just been made up by SJW snowflakes or whatever it is they're talking about these days. I don't really listen to them, but I do know that they're pushing this narrative that being trans is new and weird and has no historical precedent. You know, and I know that that's not true. But we need to push back against that narrative, and liking, commenting, and subscribing makes a big difference in helping to push back against that narrative. And also, if it pleases you, your support on Patreon makes a big difference as well. There's a link to it in the description below. It really does make a difference in helping me turn this into something that's a little more self-sustaining instead of just a very expensive hobby. If you are able, if you are willing, it starts at just $1 a month, and I do really appreciate it. You do get some nice member perks like access to videos before they come out, access to the channel's Discord, and some other fun spicy stuff too. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about some... First of all, we know who the Galli were, why they castrated themselves, and how they did the deed. We've got a whole video on that. Check that out if you're interested in the Galli. It's probably my favorite topic to date that I've covered. It's awesome, so check it out. Not all eunuchs were Galli. We also know there were some Christian eunuchs who did so for complicated reasons. There's a video on Christian eunuchs as well. You can check that out. We're setting those aside too. Today we'll talk about eunuch slaves, why they were desirable, and why the deed was done. From there, we'll take a look at Rome's complicated relationship with eunuchs over the years, and from there, take a look at the ghastly specifics of how the deed was done. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Eunuch slaves. Good times, yeah, nice, light, relaxing subject, this one, to be recording on a Monday morning. Awesome. So slavery. It was a big thing in the ancient world. It's a big thing in the modern world, even though it's de jure illegal in every country on earth. But if I start getting into the US prison industrial complex, or the tens of thousands of people living in slavery in Qatar that were used to build the World Cup stadiums and facilities that FIFA just shrugged off, or the people laboring in sweatshops to crank out crummy clothing to satisfy the West's non-stop lust for consumer goods, I'm probably going to end up falling apart and weeping at the absolute cruelty and injustices of this miserable goddamn world. This video is sponsored by Shein. Get 10% off your moral crisis with your order when you use the coupon code Sophie is sad. Anyway, yeah, slavery was a big thing in the ancient world. The first time I read Homer, one of the passages that stuck out to me was one of the descriptions of people being dragged off into slavery. Their hands were bound and their mouths were gagged, so they couldn't cry out to the gods. Instead, all they could do was raise their eyes in supplication to the heavens, to beg for deliverance from the horrible fate that surely awaited them. Yet this part's a little bit of a drag. Sorry gang. This video is sponsored by Wellbutrin. Sophie's gonna go back on her meds after this one because she's making herself sad. Anyway, the Romans quite liked their slaves to be eunuchs. As I mentioned in the YouTube short that led me to put this whole thing together, eunuchs were more likely to be obedient and less likely to sleep with your wife. So if you wanted a teacher, a messenger, a personal servant, even a doctor or a lawyer, and you had the scratch for it, you would prefer a eunuch over a non-eunuch. But they weren't cheap. In fact, there was a whole legal system put in place to govern slaves, eunuch slaves, and eunuchry in general. But before we get any further, you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with transgender history? And yeah, I mean, it's not strictly transgender history in that looking at eunuch slaves, you might not see yourself in them the way that you did with the Galli or the Inari. This is a little bit of a tangent, so you're going to find me meandering a little more than you, and I know I usually meander, but you're going to find me meandering more than usual here. It's still transgender history in that eunuchs were forcibly moving away from the gender assigned to them. That said, it is still a little bit of a tangent, but I mean, I can make tangents if I want to. Besides, remember what we talked about with the Galli. Roman legal precedent said that eunuchs were neither men nor women, but a secret third thing. So in that regard, if we take Susan Stryker's definition of transgender history as people who step outside of the societal bounds and confines of their gender, then this does count as transgender history. Sort of. Technically. I mean, it's close enough, right? No? Well, whatever. I've already written the damn thing, and I've already recorded the damn thing, and you're already here watching the damn thing, so you have no choice but to continue, and neither do I. You could navigate away, but then you'd miss out on all the oddly specific and weirdly creepy laws about eunuchs that existed in the ancient world, and you don't want to miss out on that, do you? Of course you don't. Chapter 2. The oddly specific and creepy as hell laws around eunuch slaves. The Corpus Iuris Civilis, or body of civil law, is what we now call a collection of laws passed by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I between 529 and 534 CE. But hold up, who were the Byzantines? I thought this was a video about the Romans. The Roman Empire split in half permanently in 395 CE. At that point, it became the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire. This wasn't because of a rebellion or a civil war or anything. They both considered themselves thoroughly Roman. It was just easier to manage at that point. When we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, we're usually talking about the Western Roman Empire. That fell in 476 CE or 480 CE, depending on who you ask. Julius Nepos was emperor in 474 CE and deposed the following year, 475 CE. After he was deposed, he retreated to the province of Dalmatia, which is modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Kosovo, Serbia, and parts of Albania and Croatia. While he was there, he continued to call himself emperor. Meanwhile, Romulus Augustulus sat in the city of Rome itself as emperor, but he was very quickly deposed in 476 CE, when the Germanic general Odoacer conquered the city of Rome. Some historians say this is the end of the Roman Empire in the West. That's the traditional date given. But at that point, even though Rome was still the capital of the West, it hadn't been terribly important for decades up to that point. Meanwhile, Julius Nepos stuck around, continuing to call himself Western Roman Empire from his rump state in Dalmatia, and lasted for another 4 years until he himself was assassinated in 480 CE. He didn't have a successor, and the Eastern Roman Empire didn't bother appointing a new emperor because there was not really anything to be emperor of at that point. So he was the last Western Roman emperor, and that's why I think the Roman Empire in the West fell in 480 CE, not in 476. Okay, so who were the Byzantines? The Byzantine Empire is the Eastern Roman Empire with its capital at Constantinople. The name Byzantine Empire is an invention by later historians, though. They just called themselves Romans. They didn't call themselves Byzantines. They stuck around for nearly another 1,000 years, lasting until the year 1453 CE, when the Ottomans finally conquered the city of Constantinople, and the final emperor, Constantine XI, was killed defending the city. At that point, the light of the Roman Empire was snuffed out forever. My primary historical interest is classical antiquity, which is roughly the 8th century BCE up to the 5th century CE. So I don't know as much about the Byzantines as I do the Western Romans, but they carried a lot of Roman traditions with them, including a lot of Roman legal traditions. Their system of law was a continuation of Roman law built on Roman precedents. So even though it's not exactly the same as the original, whole, complete Roman Empire, we can still make some strong inferences on how the original Roman Empire would have done so based on how the Byzantines did it. Okay. So, the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 or 480 CE, and the Corpus Iuris Civilis was written between 529 and 534 CE. So this is about half a century later, and just a few years before the Eastern Roman Empire, led by the general Belisarius, was able to conquer a significant chunk of former Western Roman territory, including the city of Rome itself. They weren't able to hold it for very long, but yeah, still Romans. Anyway, the Corpus Iuris Civilis goes into a lot of detail about slaves. It's almost creepy how specific these laws will become. People will literally devote years of their lives to coming up with very specific rules on how to govern slaves, how to buy slaves, how to sell slaves, rather than just admitting that maybe people shouldn't own other people. I guess it's because those in power benefited from the situation too much. Financially incentivized cruelty. Gotta love it. Book 6, Title 43, deals with Roman inheritance law, but it also talks about the market value for slaves as well. An adult with no particular trade was worth 20 solidi, but if they were skilled artisans, they were worth 30 solidi. Unless they were physicians or lawyers, then they were worth 50 solidi. And kids 10 years old or younger were worth 10 solidi, but these were all non-eunuchs. Eunuch slaves started at 30 solidi if they were 10 years old or younger. Adults were 50 solidi, and if they were skilled tradespeople, they were worth 70 solidi. Eunuch slaves were considered more desirable because of the points mentioned earlier, but they were also more valuable because you weren't guaranteed to survive the procedure. As messed up as this might sound, the slave owner was taking a financial risk by eunuching his slaves, so he had to charge a higher market value to make up for the product that didn't make it to the Good Lord, the last part was depressing to write. Chapter 3. Making sense of this in modern terms. What are solidi? That's the plural. Singular is solidus. A solidus was a mostly pure gold coin that replaced the aureus. It was introduced by the Roman Emperor Diocletian in the early 4th century CE and weighed 4.5 grams. It's a complicated question to look at how much ancient currency is worth in modern terms, and I don't want to get too into the thick of it here, but one way to look at this might be to consider the price of grain at the time. Around Justinian's time, they sold grain by the modius, which was a unit of measurement similar to a peck in modern terms. Ever heard that song? I love you, a bushel and a peck. That she's singing about, that's how much she loves the person she's singing to, a bushel and a peck. Or that old tongue twister, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, he picked a peck. That's what they're talking about, roughly 2 dry gallons. Around Justinian's time, you could buy 100 modii of barley with 1 solidus. But that probably doesn't give you much of an idea of what that would have been worth, so now, despite this being a transgender history channel, we're getting into ancient culinary history as well. Anyway, we don't have any actual Roman bread recipes, but what we do have are some Roman loaves of bread preserved in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. It's weird to think about, I know, but this is one of the reasons why I think Roman history is so fascinating. Walking through what we call the House of the Stags in Herculaneum, which is where this loaf of bread was found, we get an incredibly detailed view into what daily life was like for the Roman people. This particular loaf was stamped with the name of the person who cooked it. His name was Celer, by the way, and he was a slave owned by Quintus Granius Verus, a merchant who owned the House of the Stag. We know the type of oven this bread was baked in. We know some of the other kitchen tools they would have used at the time, and we even know the ingredients they used to bake the bread. We know Roman bread was designed to be pulled apart based on its shape, which gives us insight on what it might have looked like for the Romans to sit down and have a meal. We also know the name of a slave, and at least a bit of his life, which almost certainly would have otherwise been forgotten to history. These little moments remind me of the environmental storytelling you see in games like Fallout New Vegas, except instead of fiction, it's a real person's life you're peering into, frozen in time at the moment the apocalypse happened. It helps to humanize these stories as the experiences of real people, no less emotionally or intellectually complex than you or I. For all the tales of combat, of conquests, of clashing empires and dueling gladiators, of seduction, religious persecution, political intrigue and assassinations, in many ways the life of a Roman was just as boring as yours or mine, and just as easily cut short by a cataclysmic event. So we don't have any ancient sources giving us a recipe, but based on deeper analysis of this loaf, we can roughly figure it out. Max Miller over at the channel Tasting History actually baked this loaf, which is really cool. It's a lot of fun. Check it out. His recipe calls for 1 kilogram of flour, and while he probably used wheat flour to bake this particular loaf of bread, the Romans would have used barley as well, since it was pretty common in the empire. 1 modius of barley would weigh about 5.5 kilograms, rounding up. So if 1 solidi could buy 100 modii of barley, it would give you enough material to bake about 550 loaves of bread, with maybe a little bit left over. That gives us the information we need to figure out what a human life was worth in terms of loaves of bread. Children younger than 10 were worth 5,500 loaves of bread. Unskilled adults were worth 11,000 loaves of bread. Skilled adults were worth 16,500 loaves of bread. A doctor or lawyer was worth 27,500 loaves of bread. A eunuch child younger than 10 was worth 16,500 loaves of bread. A eunuch unskilled adult was worth 27,500 loaves of bread, and a eunuch skilled adult was worth 38,450 loaves of bread. Obviously, this is a huge oversimplification. It doesn't factor in things like the other ingredients that you might need to use to make a loaf of bread, like herbs or garlic or water for that matter. It also doesn't account for the variance in grain prices over time. But hopefully it at least gives you a bit of a scale of what we're talking about here. So, yeah, slaves weren't cheap, and eunuch slaves were even more not cheap. But while the Romans did commonly use slaves, they weren't a fan of the process of making slaves in the first place. Chapter 4. The Romans weren't fans of the practice of making eunuchs in the first place. We see this as far back as the life of the Roman Emperor Vespasian, as told to us by the Roman writer Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, or just Suetonius. He published his Lives of the Caesars at some point between 117 and 138 CE, during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. It was a collection of biographies starting with Julius Caesar and ending with the Roman Emperor Domitian. Vespasian was Domitian's father, so he's covered there as well. Suetonius tells us that during Nero's reign, Vespasian was the governor of Africa, which is not all of Africa, obviously, but the Roman province of Africa. It includes the northern coast of modern-day Tunisia, as well as eastern Algeria and western Libya. Suetonius tells us about Vespasian's time there. Quote,
"He was then allotted Africa as his province, which he governed with marked integrity and not a little honor. Certainly he came back not at all richer, for his credit was so near collapse that he mortgaged his properties to his brother, and was obliged to lower himself to trading in mules in order to keep up his position."
Mules, of course, is referring to eunuchs. a animal mule being the offspring of a horse and a donkey, which is infertile. Another translation of that passage said he had to resort to trading eunuchs, so clearly the Romans were not a fan of this entire practice. Side note, at one point Vespasian introduced a tax on public street washrooms, which was not terribly popular in the empire in general, but especially in Gaul, where they decided to start calling their public street washrooms Vespasiennes, and the French still call them that to this day. Don't upset the French. They have a long historical memory. After Vespasian's death in 79 CE, his son Titus became emperor. And at first the Senate was worried that they had another Nero on their hands, because apparently he had some debauched habits, shall we say. But against expectations, he seemed to have done a pretty good job ruling the empire. He's known for the completion of the Colosseum during his principate, for the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum, and for dying just 2 years into his reign. He was succeeded by his brother Domitian, and Domitian's historical reputation is not as good as his brother's. He's known for being a cruel, tyrannical, and authoritarian leader, driven as much by paranoia as he is by a genuine desire to lead. That paranoia might have come from the fact that he was openly conspiring against his brother and might have actually poisoned the guy in order to become emperor himself. Great guy. Great guy. But again, how much of this is historical slander and how much of it is genuine history? It's difficult to say. But back to the topic. He had an interesting relationship with eunuchs. I've said that a lot, haven't I? On one hand, he banned the act of castration within the empire. According to Cassius Dio, you remember him? He was one of our sources on Elagabalus. And while he was not terribly reliable when reporting on her, he is considered fairly reliable in general. Anyway, according to Cassius Dio, Titus had a thing for young boys, and this is not terribly surprising to me. Look how many people took a trip to Epstein's Island. Rich, powerful people giving into their basest instincts seems to be a well-worn tradition in human history, doesn't it? It was gross then, it's gross now, it's gross throughout history, and it's one of the reasons why anarchism is so appealing to me personally. Because if powerful people have been behaving this way for literal millennia, maybe the problem isn't this or that powerful person, but the fact that they are powerful people in the first place. I don't know. I'm just a historian. Anyway, Titus was into young boys, and apparently Domitian was not a fan of this, so he banned the act of castrating them. Not the act of doing anything else with them, I'm not going to say which, this video will definitely get banned, but the idea of just castrating them was the thing that was banned. However, Domitian also had a eunuch slave boy that he quite liked himself, named Eunuchs. We actually know a fair bit about Eunuchs, thanks to the writings of the Romans Martial and Statius. From what we can tell, Eunuchs grew up in Pergamum, which is pretty close to Mount Ida, where Hermaphroditus was mythologically born. It was where the Cybele stone came from before it was moved to Rome, and it was where the Galli came from when they moved to Rome as well. Anyway, Eunuchs was brought to Rome at a very young age, presumably during the reign of Domitian. Upon arrival, he was castrated in order to preserve his boyish beauty. Once delivered to the emperor, Eunuchs' job was to be his cupbearer. And if you know your mythology, you probably have some warning bells going off in your head right now. Ganymede, the young boy about whose beauty plenty of ancient ink was spilled, was brought to Zeus to be his cupbearer as well, which is pretty universally accepted as mythological shorthand for being there for Zeus's sexual needs. If you noticed this, you're not alone. Martial noticed it as well and mentions it when talking about Eunuchs. He stayed with Domitian for some time, wearing his hair long, which is apparently common for young Roman boys. Eventually, Domitian freed Eunuchs and allowed him to cut his hair, assumingly in his late teens. Now, all of this must have happened before Domitian's anti-castration laws, right? Because That would be hypocritical, wouldn't it? And it's hard to imagine authoritarian autocrats being hypocritical, isn't it? Especially ones with such extreme socially conservative values. That's impossible. Domitian banned the act of castration after having appointed himself censor in 85 CE, a role that, among other things, decided on Roman social values and mores of the time. He also imposed a limit on how much slave traders could charge for eunuch slaves, which was widely considered to be a good thing in spite of the fact that, as I mentioned, Romans liked their eunuch slaves. We don't know if he made an exception for the Galli, but considering how devoted he was to the Roman state religion, it seems likely. Domitian was not the only emperor to pass laws around castration, but he does seem to be the first. But it's funny because the more the Roman state put restrictions on the creation and existence of eunuchs, the more they tended to make use of them. It's worth noting that while Suetonius says that Domitian passed the castration ban, it may actually have happened under his successor, Nerva. The Digest of Justinian, another collection of laws created under the Emperor Justinian, says that the punishment for eunuching was to have to forfeit half of all your belongings. And they said this law was passed in 97 CE, which was during the reign of Nerva. Fast forward a few years, and Hadrian also passed a law banning castration. At least we think he did. There's some controversy there, and I don't care to get too into the details. But with Hadrian's law, the punishment becomes much more severe, equivalent to that of homicide. It also punishes the eunuch as well as the person doing the eunuching, so long as it was voluntary, and I don't know how you would prove that it was voluntary or involuntary. Constantine would also pass a eunuch ban around 200 years later, which implies that either the original round of eunuch laws weren't very effective, or some emperor reversed those laws in an edict that doesn't survive today. But people still got their eunuchs. Of course, if you already had the means to buy eunuch slaves, you probably had the means to travel outside of the empire in order to acquire them. The Historia Augusta, remember, super unreliable source, tells us that there were eunuchs in the court of Elagabalus, but later emperors tended to like having eunuchs in their courts as well. But these eunuchs were increasingly unlikely to be slaves. One eunuch, Eutropius, even served as consul under the Emperor Honorius in 399 CE. Consul was the second highest rank in the Roman Empire after emperor. But okay, so the Romans weren't a fan of eunuching people, and various emperors tried to pass laws banning the process of doing it with varying degrees of results. But what about the eunuchs themselves? How were they treated in Roman society? We talked about this a bit in the Galli video. Broadly speaking, they thought that people who eunuched themselves were weird and it made them uncomfortable, and they tried to keep them apart from Roman society as much as possible. But we're going to set them aside for now. We've talked enough about the Galli. This is a different topic. Up until the 3rd century CE, the Romans reported on eunuchs in a matter-of-fact sort of way. But from the 4th century CE onward, coinciding with the Christianization of the Roman Empire, they started referring to eunuchism as a problem. The Roman writer Ammianus Marcellinus, for example, wrote about this in the late 4th century CE. His work covered Roman history from the time of the Emperor Nerva to the death of the Emperor Valens in 378 CE, though unfortunately most of it is lost. What does survive covers the period from 353 to 378 CE, and since histories of the later empire are relatively rare, this is really great to have. He's generally considered reliable and mostly impartial, though he clearly does have his own biases that creep into his work. In particular, he looked down on the eunuchism in the court as a sort of moral decay that accompanied the structural decay of Roman society. As the empire starts to decay, as the societal structures start to show signs of fracture, the upper class becomes desperate to pin the blame on some external, unrelated force. As a result, they find a small minority group, at best curiosities not well understood by the masses and pin all of society's anxieties and stresses and fears onto this tiny little group, and they become the scapegoat for everything that's wrong with the world. Does any of that sound familiar? The more things change. Chapter 5. How did they do it? Alright, so we're back to the original question. How did non-Galli, non-early Christian eunuchs get created? Believe it or not, we have a pretty detailed description for how the act was done, at least in the Byzantine Empire. Our Byzantine source is Paulus Aegineta, or Paul of Aegina. We don't know much about his life, but here's what we do know. He was born on Aegina, a small island between Athens and Argos in Greece. He often mentions Alexandria in his work, which suggests that he must have traveled there quite a bit. He wrote in Greek, which was common for Byzantine scholars, and we know he practiced as a physician. Based on who he quotes and who quotes him, we think he lived during the early 7th century CE. And that's about all we know. He wrote a few different books, but the one that survives today is commonly referred to as Epitomes Iatrikes Bibliohepta, or Medical Compendium in 7 books, though we don't know what he himself called that. It's an incredible resource when it comes to understanding ancient Western medical traditions, and it includes pretty much everything that doctors would have known back then. He covers a lot of different subjects, and I'm definitely not going to list them all here, but some of the more interesting ones that I thought included how to treat injuries like burns, sprains, contusions, nerve injuries, and dozens of different types of fractures and dislocations, how to treat several different types of ulcers, how to treat dog bites, bee stings, spider bites, scorpion stings, and other poisonous and venomous injuries, how to recognize the signs of poisoning from lead, mercury, and toxic mushrooms, how to perform a bunch of different surgeries on eyes, how to perform a mastectomy on, quote, male breasts resembling the female, how to recognize 4 different types of intersex conditions, and a whole lot more. He also has a separate chapter on how to perform castration in chapter 68 of book 6, where he says, quote,
"The object of our art being to restore those parts which are in a preternatural state to their natural, the operation of castration professes just the reverse, but since we are sometimes compelled against our will by persons of high rank to perform the operation, we shall briefly describe the mode of doing it."
It's pretty clear from reading this passage that Paul is not a fan of doing this sort of thing. After all, it's the act of destroying healthy tissue on an often unwilling participant, and he'd rather heal injuries than cause new ones. But sometimes the rich make him do it, so what choice does he have? Considering the fact that he had a section on performing mastectomies for people with gynecomastia, it seems likely that it's mostly the unwilling part of it that he had a problem with. He doesn't seem to have a problem with destroying quote-unquote healthy tissue if somebody wants that to be the case. It's the unwilling part that he has a problem with. He continues.
There are 2 ways of performing it. The one is by compression, and the other by excision. That by compression is thus performed, are placed in a vessel of hot water, and then when the parts are softened in the bath, the testicles are to be squeezed with the fingers until they disappear, and being dissolved, can no longer be felt.
And, good Lord, he continues.
The method by excision is as follows. Let the person to be castrated be placed upon a bench, and the scrotum with the testicles grasped by the fingers of the left hand, and stretched. 2 straight incisions are then to be made with a scalpel, 1 in each testicle, and when the testicles start up, they are to be dissected around and cut out, having merely left the very thin bond of connection between the vessels in their natural state. This method is preferred to that of compression, for those who have had them squeezed sometimes have venereal desires, a certain part, as it would appear, of the testicles having escaped the compression.
So there you have it. You either get into a hot bath and crush them into dust, or you snip them out. That's how they did it. Ta-da! Chapter 6. Why were the Romans so weird about eunuchs? So walking away from all of this, what do we have? The Romans found the act of castration itself to be quite disturbing, but they wanted their slaves to be eunuchs. They wanted to eat their cake and have it too, essentially. But while they were legislating castration out of existence with one hand, they were buying eunuch slaves with the other. They forbade castration within the empire, but they wrote manuals on how to do it, and they hired eunuchs to serve as high-ranking positions in the imperial court. What does this tell us? This seems so wonderfully contradictory that when you first watch through this video, you might suspect that I must have read one of the sources wrong, or misquoted, or that there's a mistranslation or something there, until you remember that a dozen or so centuries later, a whole bunch of guys who owned slaves proclaimed the beginning of a new republic built on freedom. So yeah, history is kind of stupid sometimes, but some historians argue that it actually makes sense if you view it from the perspective of the royal court using these bans as a way to funnel eunuchs toward them as opposed to distributing them to the masses. After all, what greater sign is there that you hold dominion over a people than to say you have a monopoly on emasculation? They're your slaves, but you still don't get to decide what to do with them. We can, but you can't. To draw another parallel to the United States, again, consider slavery. It never really ended. Yes, you cannot go to the slave market and buy and sell slaves the way you once did, but the government is still entitled to take away nearly all of its citizens' rights and stuff them in cages, forcing them to work for pennies, all the while creating all sorts of victimless crimes that disproportionately target the same ethnic minorities that would have been victim to slavery in the first place. It's not that different, philosophically speaking. But putting that aside, it's not like government hypocrisy is unheard of either. In 2021, Alabama Senator Tom Whatley was found liking trans porn on Twitter just a week after voting for a bill that would ban trans healthcare in the state. Alex Jones, professional yelly angry man, noted for being anti-trans and like 10,000 other horrible things, showed his phone on video once, and you could see he was watching trans porn. Ditto with hateful Vespasian Nick Fuentes. Utah State Republican John Stannard, who ran on a family values platform, was found to have hired a Salt Lake City sex worker at least twice after voting against the rights of sex workers in his state. And oh yeah, there's this guy. A twice divorced serial philanderer, convicted rapist, and best buds with the most high-profile pedophile in history. Or the literal messiah, depending on who you ask. I could go on, and there are plenty of liberal examples too. Don't think you're getting things off the hook here, liberals. But the further right you go, the more of a hypocrite you tend to become. And when it comes to making sense of the Romans' contradictory attitude toward eunuchs, maybe we don't have to dig any deeper than that.